The dry wind howled through the canyon, kicking up swirls of dust as the Mustang limped forward. His once powerful legs trembled beneath him, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The wound on his flank was fresh, a deep gash left by the sharp edge of a hunter's bullet. Blood seeped into his dark coat, staining it like an omen. He had outrun them for miles, but he was slowing now. His strength was fading and he knew it. Behind him the hunters closed in. 6 men on horseback, their rifles glinting under the sun, their eyes locked onto their prize. They had tracked him for days, determined to claim the wild stallion that had eluded so many before them. He was a legend, a ghost among the wild horses of the plains. The Mustang who had never been caught. Until now. The lead hunter, a man named Briggs, pulled back on his reins, signaling the others to fan out. His lips curled into a smirk as he watched the Mustang struggle forward. "This is it, boys," Briggs called out. "End of the line." The others chuckled, tightening their grip on their reins. They knew what came next. A quick shot, a heavy thud, and a victory ride back to town with their prize strapped behind them. The bounty for this stallion was high, higher than any Mustang before him. Ranchers wanted his strength, his unbroken spirit. Others just wanted the bragging rights of having conquered the untamable beast. But the Mustang wasn't done fighting. With a sudden burst of energy, he lunged forward, his hooves pounding against the cracked earth. The pain in his leg was blinding, but he pushed through it. He could hear the hunters cursing, their horses shifting as they prepared to chase. He didn't care. He had run his whole life and he wasn't stopping now. Briggs pulled his rifle from his back, leveling it at the Mustang's flank. His finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes narrowing as he aimed. "Easy now," he muttered, steadying his shot. Then something happened that none of them expected. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the canyon, stopping the hunters in their tracks. It was low and menacing, like the growl of something ancient. The Mustang stopped too, his ears flicking toward the sound. His nostrils flared, his body tensed, and for the first time, the fear in his eyes wasn't for the hunters. The ground trembled beneath them. Briggs barely had time to register what was happening before the first shadow moved across the ridge. Then another. And another. Eyes gleamed from the rocky outcroppings, silent and watching. Shapes shifted in the sunlight, their forms blending with the desert landscape. Wolves. Not just one or two. A pack. A massive pack. The hunters had been so focused on their prey, they hadn't noticed the predators stalking them from above. The alpha, a massive black wolf with piercing amber eyes, stepped forward. He was battle-scarred and powerful, his fur thick and matted from years of fighting for survival. His pack fanned out behind him, moving like shadows, their bodies sleek and built for the hunt. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The Mustang stood frozen, his breaths ragged. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. They had rifles, yes. But rifles wouldn't save them from an entire pack. Briggs shifted in his saddle, his hand tightening around his rifle. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We can handle this." The alpha took another step forward, his gaze locked on the Mustang. And then, without warning, he let out a low, eerie howl. The pack answered. The sound filled the canyon, bouncing off the rock walls, vibrating in the hunters' chests. The horses beneath them whinnied in fear, their muscles bunching as they fought the urge to flee. The hunters gritted their teeth, struggling to maintain control. Then, as if an unspoken agreement had been reached, the Mustang moved. With a sudden, powerful surge, he bolted, straight toward the wolves. The hunters watched in stunned silence as the wolves parted, allowing the Mustang to pass through their ranks. The alpha stood motionless, his eyes never leaving the stallion as he disappeared into the canyon beyond. Briggs swallowed hard. He had never seen anything like it. The Mustang should have been dead. The wolves should have torn him apart. But instead they had let him go. "Let's get out of here," one of the hunters muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Briggs didn't argue. He turned his horse around, urging it back the way they had come. The others followed, their shoulders tense, their hands hovering over their weapons. But the wolves did not move. They only watched as the hunters retreated. As the sun began to set, the pack melted back into the shadows, their mission complete. Somewhere in the vast, untamed wilderness, the Mustang ran free. And he always would. If you loved this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more unforgettable tales of the wild. The Mustang galloped into the fading light, his hooves striking the earth with renewed determination. His muscles burned, his wounds still throbbed, but he was alive. The wolves had let him go, a rare mercy in the wild. But why? The question lingered in his mind like a shadow. The wind carried the distant sounds of the hunters retreating, their fear evident in the way their horses hurried away from the canyon. The Mustang knew they wouldn't forget him. They would return, maybe with more men, more guns, more determination. He had defied them once, but humans did not like being denied what they believed was theirs. Still, that was a battle for another day. Tonight he needed rest. He slowed his pace as he reached a small grove of twisted juniper trees, their roots clinging stubbornly to the dry earth. Here the scent of the wolves was weaker and the land felt safer. His legs finally gave in and he sank to the ground, his breathing heavy. The night was alive with sounds, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustling of unseen creatures, the whisper of the wind through the canyons. But then a different sound reached his ears. Hoofbeats. The Mustang's ears flicked forward and he forced himself upright. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He wasn't alone. A shadow moved through the trees. Then another. Eyes glowed softly in the moonlight. Horses. Not tame, not bridled, but wild. Just like him. The lead horse, a powerful gray stallion, stepped forward, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of blood. His muscles were thick with strength, his mane tangled from years of running free. The Mustang held his ground, meeting the stallion's gaze. He had fought hunters. He had faced wolves. He wasn't about to bow now. The gray snorted, stepping closer. His herd followed, their movements cautious but curious. Maras, young colts and older stallions stood in the moonlight, watching. The Mustang lowered his head slightly, not submission but respect. The gray seemed to consider him for a long moment before tossing his head, a silent invitation. The Mustang hesitated. He had run alone for so long, fought alone. But something about the herd felt right. They had survived just as he had. And so, with a final glance at the wilderness he had once ruled alone, he took a step forward. The herd parted, making room. The Mustang had found his place. But as the night deepened and the stars burned bright above, a single pair of amber eyes watched from the shadows. The alpha wolf had not left. He had followed. And in the depths of the canyon, where the hunters still plotted their return, the battle was far from over. The Mustang stood amidst his new herd, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. The gray stallion snorted, tossing his head before trotting off, signaling the herd to move. The others followed, their hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the earth. The Mustang hesitated, glancing back at the distant shadows where the alpha wolf had watched him. Something about the wolf's presence unsettled him, not fear but a feeling that their encounter wasn't over. Shaking off the thought, he turned and followed the herd. The night stretched on, the land bathed in pale moonlight. The Mustang felt the warmth of other bodies beside him, the presence of companions who understood the struggles of the wild. Some of the Maras glanced at him, curious about the newcomer. A few of the younger colts tried to test him, nipping playfully at his flanks, but the Mustang ignored them. He had earned his place among them and now he needed rest. They traveled until they reached a secluded valley hidden between towering cliffs. A small stream trickled through the rocks, offering a much-needed source of water. The Mustang dipped his muzzle into the cool liquid, drinking deeply. The wound on his flank still burned, but it was beginning to clot. With time it would heal. As the herd settled for the night, the Mustang remained awake, his ears twitching at every distant sound. The wilderness was never silent. The wind whispered through the trees, insects hummed, and the occasional distant howl of a wolf sent shivers through the herd. But none of them stirred in fear. This was their world. They belonged here. The Mustang closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. Far beyond the safety of the valley, the hunters were regrouping. Briggs sat by the fire, his jaw clenched as he sharpened his knife. The humiliation of their failure gnawed at him. That Mustang had made fools of them. Worse, he had been spared by the wolves, creatures Briggs considered nothing more than vermin. The other hunters muttered among themselves, some debating whether they should continue the chase or cut their losses. "That horse ain't normal," one of them said, shaking his head. "A Mustang shouldn't have made it out of that canyon alive." Briggs scoffed. "Superstition. That's all it is." The wolves didn't attack him because they had already eaten, or they saw a better opportunity. He smirked darkly. "Next time there won't be a pack to save him." Another hunter, a younger man named Tate, frowned. "We don't know where he went. We lost his trail." Briggs stood, shoving his knife into its sheath. "Then we find it. We've got money on this hunt. That stallion is worth more than all our other catches combined. I don't care if it takes all week, we're not leaving without him." The men exchanged uneasy glances but knew better than to argue. The hunt was far from over. The Mustang woke before dawn, his body still aching but his mind sharp. The herd stirred around him, some grazing, others still dozing in the early morning light. The gray stallion stood on a nearby ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Mustang followed his gaze. The land stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills, dry riverbeds, and distant mountains that rose like silent guardians. But something else caught the Mustang's attention. A scent. Faint but familiar. The hunters were coming. A shiver ran down his spine. They wouldn't give up. They never did. The Mustang turned back toward the herd. They didn't know what was coming. They had lived here in safety, protected by their numbers and their knowledge of the land. But the hunters had guns. They had traps. And they had revenge in their hearts. The Mustang paced, his hooves stirring the dry dirt. He had never been part of a herd before, had never been responsible for more than himself. But something deep inside told him that he couldn't let them be caught. A decision formed in his mind. He had to lead the hunters away. The gray stallion watched him as if sensing his thoughts. The Mustang stepped forward, meeting his gaze. They stood in silence for a moment before the Mustang turned and broke into a run. The herd stirred in confusion as he galloped toward the open plains, his hooves striking the ground with renewed purpose. The gray neighed after him but did not follow. The Mustang didn't look back. He had a job to do. Briggs was the first to spot him. "There he is," he roared, jerking his horse's reins. The other hunters scrambled into action, pulling their rifles and kicking their horses into a gallop. Dust exploded beneath their hooves as they tore across the land, their eyes locked on the dark figure sprinting ahead. The Mustang felt their presence long before he heard them. His heart pounded as he pushed himself faster, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. Every muscle burned, every breath came ragged, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. The hunters gained ground, their horses well-trained and relentless. A shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past the Mustang's ear. He flinched but didn't falter. He had to reach the canyon. He had to make it back to the wolves. The pack was already waiting. The alpha stood on the rocky outcrop, his amber eyes narrowing as he watched the chase unfold. His pack, numbering more than a dozen strong, crouched in the shadows, their ears pinned back. They knew what was coming. The Mustang barreled into the canyon, his hooves skidding against the stone. The hunters weren't far behind. Briggs grinned, raising his rifle. End of the line. The Mustang stopped, his sides heaving, his legs trembling beneath him. His eyes darted toward the cliffs above. The alpha let out a deep, rumbling growl. Briggs pulled the trigger. A blur of fur and fangs slammed into him before the shot could ring out. Chaos erupted. Wolves poured from the shadows, their snarls echoing off the canyon walls. Horses reared in terror, throwing their riders. Briggs hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding from his grip. The Mustang moved. With the last of his strength, he surged forward, dodging the panicked hunters and their flailing mounts. He leaped over fallen men, his hooves striking the ground with renewed power. The pack descended on the hunters like a storm. Briggs barely had time to react before the alpha lunged at him, knocking him backward. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scrambled for his rifle, but it was too late. The wolves had won. The Mustang didn't stop running until the canyon was far behind him. The wind rushed past, carrying away the last echoes of the battle. The herd was waiting. The gray stallion stood at the edge of the valley, his ears flicking forward as the Mustang approached. The others gathered around, their eyes filled with unspoken understanding. The Mustang slowed to a trot, his body battered but his spirit soaring. He had won his freedom. And he had earned his place. As the sun rose over the wild lands, the Mustang lifted his head and neighed, a sound of triumph, of survival. Of the untamed heart that would never be broken.